Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tevav. We started our discussion yesterday with holacha shelo berega. We were talking about walking, a way of conveying. Okay, walking is maybe not the best word. Conveying the blood from the place of slaughter to the altar. That we said, can it be done if you don't move your feet? Okay, that's the whole question. So we ended with the statement of Ulla in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, holacha shelo berega lo shma holacha. This is not holacha. Okay, which has all sorts of ramifications, right? Yesterday was mainly discussing if you weren't walking when you were conveying it, would a machshava, right? If you had an intent, an incorrect intent, would it mess up the korban? Because it's not actually called holacha, right? So it wouldn't, if you would say it's not. But we also have to discuss, does that mean, it's one of the things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to bring it to the altar. And if you bring it without moving your feet, does that mean it's an invalid holacha? Okay, so that's what the Gemara wants to know. And I mean, it is an invalid holacha. The question is, does it disqualify the korban? That's always the big question. So that's where we start today. Efshar l'takuna, or lo efshar l'takuna. So if you got this, the Kohen moved the blood from one place to the other without moving his feet, is there a way to fix it? And can you just bring the blood back and say, okay, now we're going to redo it, take two. So, Tashma, let's learn from here. What source? The one we ended with yesterday, one of the sources we brought, right? We were trying to figure out, is it holacha, is it not holacha? We brought three sources, one of them and each one actually didn't end up being conclusive. And this one we actually reinterpreted. They're going to say, even according to both interpretations, you can actually get to an answer from here. Tashma, kibel hakasher v'natan pasul. If a kosher Kohen got the blood, handed it off to a pasul, yachzir lakasher. So he returns it to the one who, right, it sounds like, according to the first interpretation, the way we had it, it goes all the way back to the Kohen and the Kohen brings it back again. Sounds like you can fix it, right? Here it sounds like it was just maybe passed and not actually walked. So it looks like you can redo it. Even if you say he can just hand it off to the next person, in other words, it doesn't have to go all the way back. It can be passed to the Kohen. Either which way, if you thought it couldn't be fixed, then there would be, right, if you hold that passing it, right, and getting it closer to the altar, right, is not going to be valid, it's going to disqualify it, well, then this should be disqualified. To which the Gemara says, how do you know what was going on here? And that we're assuming, okay, and we assumed this yesterday also, that it was being handed off, right, from the point where the slaughtering happened, and it was like in a line or going toward the Mizbech. So the Gemara says, Misavar to Kaisar Gavai. In other words, the issue there is more that someone else was holding it, not necessarily that it was getting there without moving your feet. So if you think, right, who says that the Zar was inside, meaning in the line, if you put like an X in the spot where the slaughter was, and then you want to get from there to the altar, who says it's the line from X to the altar? Look, the Kaisar Barai. It could be that the Kohen gave it to a Zar who was in the other direction, moving from X away from the altar. And therefore, this doesn't prove anything about holacha. So we're moving off that source. But, Itmar Amar Ulla. Now, we quoted Ulla at the end of yesterday's daf, and Ulla said, holacha shelo beregel is not called holacha. But now we have a bit of a stronger language of Ulla that was quoted also by Ulla. Itmar, also in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Ulla, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, holacha shelo beregel psula. If you do holacha without moving your feet, it's disqualified. It disqualifies the sacrifice. So that's pretty clear. Ama lo efshar l'takuna. If you say something's disqualified, it means it can't be fixed. So that's pretty clear. Eitibei Rav Nachman le'Ulla. But now Rav Nachman comes in, he's going to question Ulla about this from a Mishna. This is a Mishna on Daf Lamed Bet. It says, Nishpach min hakli al haritzpa va'asafo kasher. If the blood, okay, let's go through again what happens. Okay, today we're going to get a little gory. Wait till we get to the Olat HaOf today. That's going to be really gory. But this may be a little less. They slaughter the animal. They catch the blood in a vessel. Then they take the vessel and they walk it to the altar, and then they put the blood on the altar. But what if, after it was in the vessel, it spills on the floor? Well, the Kohen can collect it, and it's good. Now, so what's the assumption here? Well, what happens when you spill blood on the floor? Don't you assume the blood trickled toward the altar? And if the blood trickled toward the altar, that will be a holacha shelo b'regel. So how can you recollect this and put the blood on the altar when we said it's disqualified if there's some sort of conveying without feet? What is this if not without feet, right? It's not without anything, right? It's without anything. It just spilled. To which the Gemara says, it spilled outside, right? And as we're talking about, the Kohen can collect it as long as it's spilled in the direction away from the altar, not in the direction toward the altar. So the Gemara says, okay, what reality are we talking about? Imagine you spill a cup of water on the floor. What happens? It goes in all directions. There's no possibility of you dropping the blood and it only goes in the direction away from the altar. That would be strange. Well, maybe not too strange. The Gemara is going to give 3 possibilities about how that could happen. And then again, that would say, so if we can say that this is talking outside, then this has nothing to do with our topic. So either makom midron, okay, we all know if your floors are not right straight and they're slanted, the water, you spill water on the floor, it's only going to go in that direction. Ibayit ema beguma, or there's a hole. Okay, I have this problem. When I redid my floors many years ago, the person who did the floors didn't do them straight, and every time water spills, it always collects in one spot. Like it's just what always happens. So I'm very familiar with this makom midron, and the water only goes one way. The other option is there's a guma. Okay, there's a hole in the middle of the ground, and that's exactly where the blood happened to fall. Okay, into that hole. V'bait ema b'smicha. You could have very thick blood. Sometimes blood is very thick, and then theoretically it could only go in one direction. It won't be, so liquidy that it's going to spill everywhere. So those are 3 possible ways that we can understand this Mishnah, and then the Mishnah won't be telling us anything about holacha shelo b'regel because it's theoretically it didn't, or the way we're understanding the Mishnah now, not theoretically. The way to read the Mishnah, this is what we call an ukimta. Right, we're going to say the Mishnah is only in unique cases where the blood went away from the altar and not toward the altar. Because if it goes toward the altar, it would be holacha shelo b'regel, and perhaps that would be disqualified, and that would resolve the difficulty against Ulla. So now they're going to say, wait a minute. You think that the author of this Mishnah would tell us a situation that's such a unique, rare situation that if the blood falls from the kli, right, from the vessel, and it falls into a hole, or it falls angled the other direction, or it falls into, what was the third? The very thick blood. Come on. That's not what the Mishnah is talking about, okay? Now, sometimes we have ukimtot that are a little bit out there, but this just seems, if that's what they were talking about, they should have told you that, because, right? So that doesn't really make any sense. So basically, Rav Nachman saying, Ulla, the answer to your question is really not a good one. I'm going back to saying, this Mishnah raises a difficulty on your opinion, and because it really makes it seem like the blood theoretically could have spilled toward the altar, and we don't disqualify it. Ve'od, and furthermore, if you want to say that there is this split, some cases, if it goes away or in a hole, it'll be fine. If it goes toward the altar, it's going to be a problem. Well, that doesn't really make sense in light of another Mishnah, because if you just had this Mishnah, it says fell into the kli and fell from the kli to the floor and you collected it, would be fine. Maybe it's fine in unique circumstances. Okay, maybe we could get away with it. But there's another Mishnah that actually says, when does it fall on the ground that it would be disqualified? And it doesn't talk about our situation. So it's not so much that, but we'll see in a minute how the Gemara raises the difficulty. In a different parak, in Daf Kaf Hey, in chapter 2, it says, Nishbach alav ritzpa v'asafo pasul. If it falls directly not into a vessel, it didn't go into the kli sharet and then fall on the floor, but it falls directly from the animal's neck onto the floor. Then, if the Kohen collects it, it's disqualified. He can't use that blood. Now, since already there, they start distinguishing, right? There's on Lamed Bet, they tell you a case where it's good, where you can collect the blood. On Kaf Hey, they tell you can't collect the blood in this case. So if they're already making these distinctions when you can collect the blood, when you can't collect the blood, then liflog bedide, then the Mishnah Lamebet should have distinguished and said explicitly. And that, in fact, is a tiyufta. As they should have said there, when are we saying that you can collect the blood? If it was slanted, the floor, if there was a hole, or if it went the other direction. But if it went inside, okay, they don't even give all those specific examples. They're just saying as long as it went outside. It could have just even simply said that. But if it went inside, again, outside just means away from the altar rather than toward the altar. But if it went toward the altar, it's pasul. It should have said that. Now, if already a different Mishnah started saying when you can't collect it and it's disqualified, then this Mishnah should have specified also in this situation, there's two tracks. One that's kasher, there's one that's pasul. Should have said that, and therefore tiyufta. Therefore, this really ends as a difficulty against Ulla's, learning from Ulla that it's really pasul and that you can't fix it. Doesn't really make so much sense from here, because then this blood should be disqualified and it's not. Itmar. So we're left there with a little bit of not so clear, because we did have an answer, but we kind of rejected it. Itmar. Holacha shelo beregal machloket Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Now we're going to go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah basically talked about the Pesach, the Chatat, Shechatan Shelo Lishman. Okay, what happens? Not only Shechatan Lo Lishman, also Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, any Machshava of Lo Lishman for a Chatat and a Pesach disqualifies the offering. Then came Rabbi Shimon. And what did Rabbi Shimon say? I'm going to read the words because it's important to go back to we're going to go back to this soon. Rabbi Shimon machshir bihiluch. He says a disqualified machshava, you have the wrong intent for the sacrifice, doesn't mess you up in hiluch, in holacha. Why does he say this? Those are all necessary. But you can manage without hiluch, because you could slaughter it next to the altar and then just immediately sprinkle the blood, right? Pour the blood on the altar from where you are, or pass it upward. We're going to talk about this soon. Okay? Now, we're going to have a totally complete new interpretation. We understood that very simply as Rabbi Shimon says, any machshava during hiluch is not a problem, right? Not going to mess up your offering. But Amar Rabbi Shimon ben didn't go back to the right place. So halacha shelo beregel is a machloket Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon's only talking in the Mishnah when he says behiluch, it's not a problem. Machshir behiluch. Machshir behiluch, if it's hiluch, that if it's holacha shelo beregel. Okay? Now, what does this mean? Well, the Gemara is going to explain a little more, so let's keep going. Beholacha, we're going to talk about holacha rabati, holacha zutrati. Rabati means great. Zutrati means small. Okay, great meaning large and small. What does it mean? A great large walking and small walking? Very simply, it's kind of confusing language. It just means holacha with your feet is a lot of walking. Holacha without your feet, because what's usually holacha without your feet? Just passing. So that's short. That's small walk, small holacha. So baholacha rabati kule amalo pligi dipsula. Even Rabbi Shimon agrees that if you did a holacha beregel and you had a machshava that you're walking this to the altar for the wrong korban, disqualifies it. Okay, completely different from what we thought. We thought holacha never disqualifies because you can manage without it. But according to this interpretation, he thinks that while you're taking this blood, you're conveying it to the altar. Everyone agrees that if you have a thought, you're doing it by foot. You have a thought that you're doing it for the wrong korban, disqualified. Ki pligi, what's the machloket? Holacha zutalti. Their machloket is only holacha shelo beregel. If you're passing it to someone, so Rabbi Shimon says, oh, that's not really passing. And the rabbi, and therefore your machshava you're going to have there is not really significant. And the rabbis say, it is. Okay, and that's the machloket. The reaction to this, we get a reaction from the rabbis in Israel. When the rabbis in Israel get wind of this interpretation, they start mocking this interpretation. Now, why they mock this interpretation is not clear. We're going to have two interpretations. So, the first is going to have to do with the Chatata Oath that I told you we're going to get into some gory details about the bird's sin offering. Birds don't get slaughtered in the temple. We do malika. Okay, malika is a certain way that the Kohen would kind of press his thumb in the back of their neck and kill the animal in that way. That would be the way it would be slaughtered in the temple. That's a kosher shechita in the temple. It's not kosher shechita if you do that outside the temple. And if you slaughter the bird in the temple, it doesn't work either. So that is the way to kill birds in the temple. So now, he takes this, okay, so it's going to be a little gory, be prepared. He takes the bird. He does that act of malika, kills the bird. On the altar, he's standing on the altar. Forget about where we normally slaughter. He's standing on the altar. Then he waves the animal. The blood starts spurting out, and then it goes onto the altar. And that's how he does what it's called here haza'at hadam. I mentioned once before that it's rikah is not always the correct word. It's not always poured. Sometimes it's placed, right? We talked about the tefillat etzba. In this case, it's squeezed kind of. He squeezes the animal, the blood comes spurting out, and it's called haza'at. It's like kind of a sprinkling of the blood. It gets sprayed, maybe is even a better word, onto the altar. Okay, that's what you have to know about chatat ha'of. And the other thing you have to know about chatat ha'of, there is a place where it talks about that in haza'at chatat ha'of, your machshava could ruin the chatat. Okay, so we know that machshava poselet. Okay, that a wrong intent can ruin the chatat ha'of during the sprinkling, not just during the slaughtering, and during some process of the sprinkling of it. So now they're going to assume that what's the problem. So now it's unclear whether the Israeli rabbis are speaking. It seems likely that we just know that the Israeli rabbis laughed at this or mocked it, but we don't know why, and now they're coming up with an interpretation. We know by chatat ha'of that your machshava could ruin it. There's no case, according to Rabbi Shimon, where it could actually be ruined. Why? Well, let's think of the process. There's the slaughtering, which is really malika, so that we could have. But we're talking about after that. Now, you start waving it. Waving it would be similar to the parallel to conveying, because that's the way you're kind of getting the blood onto the altar, by waving it. Now, the waving is holacha shelo beregel, right? Because you're not moving your feet. The Kohen's just standing there waving the animal. So it would be a case of holacha shelo beregel. Now, let's say you had a thought before the blood comes out. So that's lav klumhu, because there's no significance to the act yet. It's just holacha, you're waving the animal, no blood has come out. So it's not the zrika yet. It's holacha, but it's holacha shelo beregel, and that machshava lo poselet, according to Rabbi Shimon. And ibatar denafik dam, if the blood starts spraying out already, well, it avid le mitzvato. What does it mean to spray the blood? Think about it, okay? Is the act when it leaves the body of the animal, because then it's kind of spraying, right? Or is it when it gets to the altar? So right now they assume that as soon as it leaves the body of the animal and starts heading its way toward the altar, at that moment already you fulfill the mitzvah. So it's too late to have a pasal machshava because the mitzvah is done. You can't ruin a mitzvah that's already completed. Now, even though it's not fully completed, but right now we're going to assume that's completed because haza'at is sprinkling and that already left the animal, the bird's body. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not true, what you just said. My kushya, why is that so difficult? Dilma mi de parish adimata the mizbeach. You could say from the moment it left the animal's body, the bird's body, until it actually reached the altar. That is still, you haven't really fulfilled the mitzvah of haza'ah until it gets to the altar. Which means you could have a pasal machshava there, that would be during the zrika process, which is really haza'ah here, right? But it's parallel to what we call zrika, and that would work. Even according to Rabbi Shimon, because there is a time after the holacha shelo beregel where someone could mess it up with their machshava, so that didn't work. How do we know? Now they want to prove that until it gets to the altar, it actually hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah completely. Okay, we love Rabbi Yirmiyah questions. Here comes another one. Okay, a classic Rabbi Yirmiyah absurd situation happening, like hard to imagine this would really happen. But you see here that Rabbi Yirmiyah gets these theoretical ideas, and that's why they're quoting him to show, look, this proves what Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, and the answer he got proves what we're looking for, which is that the haza'ah is really not complete until it gets to the altar. Here's this funny question, or unpleasant question, you could say. Hayamazeh, we have a Kohen who's doing this action. He's waving the blood from, waving the bird to get the blood to come out. Vinikta, now he already, the blood starts coming out. His hand gets cut off, which makes him a Baal Mum, which makes him a blemished Kohen who can't do the avoda anymore. And the blood hasn't yet gotten to the airspace of the altar. So it's this in-between when the blood starts leaving the animal's body, but hasn't yet come down to the altar. What's the halacha? He wants to know, is this going to be disqualified because now the Kohen is a Baal Mum and he's still doing the act of the spraying of the blood. Va'amar le psula. He says yes, he's disqualified. This avoda is disqualified. You have to start the korban all over again. My taima v'hiza v'natan be'inan. You need v'hiza v'natan. V'hiza is to sprinkle and v'natan, and he put it on the altar. It didn't get onto the altar yet. So the actions are complete. What do you see? That whole part is considered haza'ah. So we have an answer to the difficulty. So that obviously wasn't what troubled the rabbis in Israel. Ki atu Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua mi Bei Rav, and Rav Papa and Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua came from the Beit Midrash. Amrei hainu chocha. Here we have these Amoraim from Babylonia, and they come and they say, we got it. We know what was bothering these rabbis in Israel. What's the problem? And this is a much simpler issue. They say, Amrei hainu chocha. This is what they were mocking. Uba holacha rabati lo pligi. Were they not disagreeing in a case of holacha in the Mishna? V'haki pligi b'holacha rabati pligi. It's obvious they were arguing about holacha rabati, about conveying it while moving your feet. Ella b'holacha zutrati kule alma lo pligi de lo pasla ki pligi b'holacha rabati. Okay, it's clear that holacha zutrati in holacha shelo b'regel, there is no machloket. It doesn't disqualify. Okay, their whole machloket is holacha rabati. Now, why is that? Well, if you look at the Mishnah, it's very obvious. What does it say in the Mishnah? It says that Rabbi Shimon explains his reason. And what does he say? He says, when you're conveying this blood, right, you don't have to convey the blood. You can get away without conveying it because you can do the slaughtering right next to the altar. Now, what conveying is he talking about there? He's obviously talking about conveying it by foot because that's the part that you don't have to do. But if you're standing at the foot of the altar, and that's where you do the slaughtering, he can't possibly be saying you don't need to do conveying by hand, because when you're at the bottom of the altar, you have to pass it onto the altar. There has to be some conveying going on. That is a conveying that has to happen. It's essential. And his whole theory was, you don't mess it up in holacha because it's not essential. You can do without it. Well, you can't do without conveying it by hand. If you collect the blood at the bottom, of the altar, you have to still pass it to the altar to get it up the altar. So it can't be holacha sutrati that they're arguing about. It must be holacha rabati. And then we're going to say that a machshava during holacha, your hand, everyone agrees that actually is no problem. The problem is the holacha b'reka. Okay, that's the machloket. That's the machloket between them, where Rabbi Shimon says it's not necessary, and therefore a machshava you're going to have there is not relevant, right? It's not going to mess up your korban, and the rabbis say it does. So we now go back to understanding Rabbi Shimon the way we understood him originally, or at least we raised a big problem with this interpretation. Why we understood now why the Israeli rabbis were mocking it. Okay, now we get to another topic, holicho zal. So we started off our daf with, can you fix a situation if there was holacha shelo b'regel? What if a non-Kohen moved the blood, transported it to the altar, and then hichziro Kohen v'chazar v'holicho, and then a Kohen took it back and then brought it to the altar? Pligi ba b'nei Rabbi Chia v'Rabbi Yanai. Okay, the sons of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yanai disagree about this. Chad amar kasher, chad amar pasul. One says it's good, one says it's no good. Mar savar efshar l'takuna, umar savar lo efshar l'takuna. Okay, one holds you can't fix it. If we go by what the first person did, if the first person messed it up, it's messed up. The second interpretation is to say, no, you can fix it. So the fact that a zar carried it doesn't bother us as long as we bring it back to where we started. Have the Kohen carry it. He can fix it. We go by the second action. That's what's important. Now we have the reverse case. Holicho Kohen, vichziro, v'chazar v'holicho zal. We have a Kohen brings the blood to the altar, but then decides to turn around and bring it back. and then a non-Kohen brings it to the altar. So now, what's the situation? We're going to have two ways of viewing this machloket. One is to view it in light of the previous machloket. If we take the previous machloket and we basically say, one said we go by the action of the first person, and if that's disqualified, that's disqualified. Then we're going to say here, well, we go by the first action, that's the Kohen, and it was a good action, so it's going to work. So that's what Rav Shimi bar Ashi says. I'm Rav Shimi bar Ashi. L'divrei machshir pasul, l'divrei posel machshir. So let's start with the second one, because that's the one I started with. The one who disqualified in the first case is going to say that's because it started off wrong. This one started off fine, and it was conveyed to the altar perfectly. The fact that after someone moved it and brought it back, and they weren't right, and they shouldn't have brought it back, that doesn't bother us. If you say, in the first case, well, the Tsar brought it, but in the end, the Kohen brought it. So we're going to go by what happens in the end. If we go by what happens at the end, that's the divrei machshir in the first case. It's going to be posel in this case. Because in the end, how does it get brought to the altar? By a wrong person. So that's going to disqualify. So that's one interpretation of the machloket that is completely dependent on what you say in the previous, right? That those are linked. They're the same idea. Obviously, you come up with the opposite conclusion in each case, but that's because the cases are opposite. But Rav Amal, even the one who apostles it there, and basically goes by, right, the first action, here, pasul. Now, what Rav Shimi bar Ashi thought is that he's going to be machshir in this case, because the Kohen brought it first. But no, even he's going to say it's pasul, meaning everyone's going to think it's disqualified, my time, and what's the reason? It has to be brought to the altar in a kosher way before it gets sprinkled. In other words, right, we need this, you need, in the end, right, it's very nice that it was done, but it was undone. So once it got undone, we need it to be done properly. It needs to be done. The blood that we're going to have take in hand right now has to have been brought in a kosher manner. Okay, that's what he basically, it has to be brought in a kosher manner. And this wasn't. Okay, it doesn't matter. Right, the order is irrelevant, right? Even if you say the order in the previous, right, was a problem, but this has to be brought, right, by a kosher person at the end. So this is no good. Amar le Rav Yirmiyah le Rav Ashi, hachi amar Rav Yirmiyah midifti, hatzarich lamtruye machloket Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan. Okay, going back to our Mishnah, and now we're going to reinterpret. Okay, something else we saw in our Mishnah, just like we reinterpreted the machloket Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbis, we're going to have a different interpretation of Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbis in our Mishnah. You might not remember. We're going to go through what it is right now. So we're at the top of Amud Bet, and Rabbi Yirmiyah comes and says to Rav Ashi, Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti said that this issue of does it need to be brought to the altar is actually a debate, right? You need that final action to be kosher before you get the blood. Does the blood in the end have to be brought, right? The blood that I have in hand right now had to have been brought in a kosher manner, okay, right before I get it, okay? That is a machlok of Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbis. So let's see. Ditnan. Rabbi Eliezer omer, hama'alech b'makom shetzarich la'alech, machshava poselet. Makom she'en tzarich la'alech, en machshava poselet. This doesn't yet mean anything for our purposes. First, we're going to just quote Rabbi Eliezer. Then, what Rav Yirmiyah midifti said, that was quoted then by Rav Yirmiyah, is going to be explained the way Rav understands this Mishnah. Okay? It's going to be based on that. So Rabbi Eliezer said, what kind of holacha is going to be problematic? Holacha that is necessary. Now, we talked before about if we put an X by the spot where the slaughtering was, and we draw a line to the altar. That's the way we understood Rabbi Eliezer. If you walk in that line, right, you walk on that path, that's when your holacha will mess it up. If you did a circuitous route, you went somewhere else, we don't know exactly what, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. The Kohen decided to take a little walk around the Azara, not toward the altar. It's not going to ruin it. And Tanakama seems to think, no, any kind of holacha, you're walking with the blood, it's going to disqualify it if you have the wrong machshava. So now comes Rav and he says, Amar Rav, hakol modim, they all agree. If you got it far, if you got the blood, you collected it was slaughtered, and you collected the blood far from the altar, and you're now bringing it to the altar, of course it's going to be disqualified. And And if you got the blood close to the altar, and then you decided to go in the complete opposite direction, even the rabbis would agree, that's not holacha. You're going away from the altar. So what's their machloket? According to Rava, lo nechleku ela keshechniso v'chazar v'hotzia. They're arguing specifically in our case. If you brought the blood to the altar, and then you brought it back, and now you're bringing it a second time, how do we view that second time, that holacha? Is your machshava going to be posel or not? So Mar Savar Hatzarich Lam Tuye. Tanakama holds you have to bring it back. So because you have to bring it back, that's holacha, and you have the wrong machshava, you're going to ruin it. Umar Savar Lav Kiluch Hatzarich Lavodadami. And the other opinion, which is Rabbi Eliezer holds, no, this is not necessary because it was already conveyed to the altar in a kosher manner. So the fact that someone removed it, okay, it just has to get there, but that's not part of the avoda anymore. That's not critical. And that's how Rava understands their machloket, and therefore, Rav Yirmiyah comes to Rav Ashi and says, this is right, and quotes Rav Yirmiyah Midifti, who bases it on Rava's explanation of their machloket, that whether or not Tzarich Lam Tuye is actually a machloket, right? What Rava basically said, Af l'divrei posel pasul, right? Both those opinions are going to say it's pasul because Tzarich Lam Tuye, we're now pointing out it's a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, whether Tzarich Lam Tuye or not. Obviously, the rabbis do think Tzarich Lam Tuye, which would make sense that we would paskin like the rabbis. Anyway, the problem is, comes Abaye and says, you got it all wrong, Rava. Eitiv Abaye. He says, Abaye says, I'm going to quote you a Braita. Now, in this Braita, it expands on our Mishna and explains exactly in which case Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. And it's not what you just said. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, right? Only if you're walking in a place where the machshava is where you're supposed to be walking, then your machshava is going to ruin it. Ketzad, what would be a case? If you got it far away from the altar and you need to bring it closer to the altar, that's unnecessary. But if you got it near the altar and you walked in the opposite direction, that's a case that you don't need. And that case, the rabbis disagree with him because that's the case he's talking about. And but then you can infer from there the fact that the Braita doesn't say the case that Rava said is that he thinks, right, if you took it away and then when you bring it back, that's already halacha that you need. And then even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that you would need. And then they don't argue in that case. And then their argument is not all about Tzarich Lam Tuye. Everyone would agree Tzarich Lam Tuye. And what's Rava's reaction? And a very interesting way to end our chapter. Amar le, Tanya. If you quote me a Braita, right? I didn't know about this Braita, but now that you quote me the Braita, I guess you're right, and I'm wrong. And he steps down from his position. It's a nice way to end the chapter because it's nice to know that people admit their mistakes and realize and say, okay, I accept, right? And in all these arguments we have all the time, right? Not everyone's always willing to accept when they made a mistake. He says, okay, I didn't know about that Braita, and now I'm willing to change my position. So that whole thing, basically, everything we learned from the top of this Amabet is rejected because we tried to say that Tzarich Lam Tuye is a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, and now we proved it's not actually. And we go back to, just like we did in the other section with Rabbi Shimon, we thought to suggest a different interpretation of a machloket in the Mishna. In the end, we go back to the original interpretation, which is just, he's talking about, right, on that path, or are you going in the other direction? Okay, now we're going to start the next chapter. We're going to have a list of disqualified korbanot. Okay, and then we're going to, what the Gemara is going to proceed to do for the next while is go through each of these disqualifications. And where do we get it from? What's the source? So today we're only going to get to the first. Kol Zevachim, in other words, in the Gemara we'll only get to the first, and the Mishna we're going to go through all of them. Kol Zevachim, shekiblu damam, any sacrifice where the blood was collected by a zar, a non-Kohen, onen, a Kohen who is in between one of his close relatives died, and they haven't buried them yet. Tvul Yom, right? All these people can't do the avoda, basically, can't accept the blood. A Tvul Yom is someone who is impure and went to the mikveh in the morning, but didn't yet wait for the sun to set, right, for the 3 stars to come out. Michusar Kippurim. These are a bunch of people who were like a Zav, a Mitzorah. They went to the mikveh on the 7th day. Then they're supposed to bring a sacrifice on the day of the 8th. So they got through the night, But then they didn't wait. So they didn't bring the korban yet on day number 8. So they're like day number 8 in the morning in the temple, and they accept the blood when they haven't finished their atonement process because they haven't brought the sacrifices they're supposed to bring. Umechusar begadim. This is the topic of a lot of the shiurim this week, very appropriate for Yom Kippur. The Beyond the Daf shiurim about mechusar begadim, missing clothing, meaning the kohen's not wearing the proper kohen clothing. Okay, because this comes up in the daf, so both Gefet this week, which went up yesterday, last and Hain Shir, which I think is going up tomorrow because it's more connected with stuff going up in the next, come up on Yud Zayin Yud Chet, about the big day kahuna. Those will be, right, and they're all kind of connected with Yom Kippur. Those shiurim, if you want to listen to them. Anyway, and also Daf Mishalahem this week was on the big day kahuna. So the mechusar begadim, also, a kohen does the avoda without wearing all the proper clothing. That disqualifies the avoda. Shelo rachatz, right? It talks about how central the clothing is. Shelo rachatz yadayim v'raglayim. Okay, you have to wash your hands and feet. If you don't do that, disqualified. Arel, it's a kohen who's not circumcised. This is even if he has an exemption from circumcision. That would be if his brothers died in circumcision. Then there's a chazaka in the family that children died from circumcision and you're allowed to not be circumcised, but you can't do avoda in the temple. Tameh, he's impure at the time. Yoshev, he's sitting, right? Some of these are a status, some of them are permanent, some of them are, just momentary. You just happen to be sitting, which you're not allowed to do. Now, not only you're not allowed to sit, you're supposed to stand, and you're supposed to stand on the floor without any chatzitza, anything interposing between you and the floor. So, omer al gabe kelim, if he was standing on vessels, al gabe behema, on an animal, al gabe raglei chavero, standing on his friend's feet. Doesn't sound so nice. But either which way, pasal. Okay? They are the avodah is disqualified. Kibel b'smol, pasal. Also, using his left hand. You're not allowed to use your left hand. It's disqualified. Rabbi Shimon machshir. So Rabbi Shimon permits. So dafka, the left hand, there's a debate. If it's done by the left, is it okay or is it not? Or does it disqualify? Now the whole korban is disqualified. You have to start from the beginning. So now the Gemara starts off with zar minalam. Where do we get it from? So to understand this, I want to first read you some verses in the Torah because you have to see these are very much taken out of context. So Vayikra Kaf Bet, chapter 22, starts off. God commands Moshe, Taber al Aaron ve'al banav, speak to Aaron and his sons. Vayinazru. Okay, it's hard to understand what this word is. It sounds like Nazir. Also, Zar is in there. We're going to talk about that soon. But you should separate yourself, Mikodshe b'nei Yisrael, from the sanctified items of the Jewish people. Now, this is weird. Aaron and his sons are supposed to not separate themselves. So, it's a little bit of a strange pasuk. V'lo yechalelu et shem kodshi, so that you don't desecrate my name, asher hem makdishim li, that they sanctify to me, ani Hashem, I am God. Now the next pasuk makes it clear what we're talking about. Emor alehem l'dorotechem, tell them that for generations, kol ish asher yikrav because archem el kodashim asher yikdishu b'nei Yisrael, if you get it close to any of the sanctified items that are sanctified by the Jews, la'Hashem v'tumato alav, when you're tamei. Okay, the topic is tamei. Now that's not what we're looking for here. We're looking for zar. But the topic in these psukim is an impure person. V'nechrita nefesh, okay, you're going to get curried. Okay, don't come. Now we understand. The pasuk before was also talking about getting close to kodashim when you're impure. But what we're going to do here is connected to also a zar doing the avoda. So zar minalam, where do we get it from? Detani Levi. Levi brings a brayta that says, Daber al Aaron ve'al banav yinazru mikodshe b'nei Yisrael. B'nei Yisrael l'mutemai. Why do you have to say kodshe b'nei Yisrael? It's any kodashim. Okay, and we're going to go through a list now. Any kodashim, right? Doesn't matter whether they're B'nai Yisrael. B'nai Yisrael, by the way, could be male. So they say maybe it's coming l'me'utei, l'me'utei, what's coming to exclude? Why does it say specifically the kodshim of B'nai Yisrael? Is it l'me'utei nashim? Ilem l'me'utei nashim. If you say it's to say, only men's sacrifices you shouldn't come near when you're impure. But you can come near women's sacrifices when you're impure. Korban nashim b'tuma karev? No way. Obviously, there's no difference between men's sacrifices and women's sacrifices. No reason to think that women's sacrifices could be sacrificed when the Kohen's impure. Ela l'mi'ute goyim, or of de kochavim, if you want to say non-Jews who come to the temple, and maybe their sacrifices could be brought b'tuma. Well, hashjet tzitz lo meratzeh. The tzitz is meant, that's this head plate that the Kohen Gadol wears, that if the Kohen Gadol is wearing it when avoda is done in impurity by accident, it atones for what happens. Now, the tzitz does not atone for sacrifices of Gentiles that were brought in impurity. Okay, only sacrifices of Jews. How do we know this? Well, the Amar Mar, it says, "Uvagoyim bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid lo hurtza," and therefore, okay, bagoyim bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, it doesn't matter whether they did intentionally, unintentionally. The tzitz is not meratze. Okay, the tzitz does not atone for any sacrifice that was done of impurity of a non-Jew. But what's obvious from here? Betuma karev. And it's, forget about the fact that obviously it can't be brought betuma. And not only that, but the tzitz won't even atone for you. At least, like the Jew sacrifices can't be brought betuma, but the tzitz will be meratze. But if we say the tzitz is a meratze, obviously it can't be brought in impurity. So it can't be telling you that it's a non-Jew sacrifice could be brought in impurity. So, meaning when the Kohen's impure. So therefore, we're stuck with understanding why is Bnei Yisrael mentioned in the pasuk. So now they say, we're going to darshan this completely, not the simple reading. Elahachi kamar, vayinazru mikodshei Bnei Yisrael v'lo yechalalu. The topic is Bnei Yisrael should be yinazru. They should stay away from the kodashim, and then they won't desecrate them. Meaning, if you're a Bnei Yisrael and you're not a Kohen, you shouldn't be coming anywhere near the kodashim, and that's the pasuk for the zar. So it's definitely not the simple reading of that pasuk, but it is a creative reading. Second option, okay, if you didn't want to accept that one, so Debei Rabbi Ishmael Tana, in the house of Rabbi Ishmael, they brought this following drasha. Oh, you can learn it from a simple kavachomer from a balmum. A blemished kohen, ma balmum she'ochel. Okay, now a blemished kohen can't do the avoda, but he can eat the meat that is meant for kohanim. So if he can eat the meat, and yet imavad chilel, but if he does the avoda, it's no good, it's disqualified. Zal she'eno ochel eno din she'imavad chilel. A zar who can't eat the meat that's meant for the kohanim because he's not a kohen, wouldn't you think all the more so? If he did avoda, it would be disqualified. So that's Kav Chomer. Come back to this Kav Chomer tomorrow and see whether this Kav Chomer really stands. So what we did today was, we started with this question. If you did holacha shelo beregel, since holacha has to be beregel, and you did it without beregel, could you fix it? Can you redo it? Okay? And then we had, right, we kind of said no, but then we kind of said that no answer was kind of difficult. So then we got to that perhaps holacha shelo beregel, we had a unique interpretation of Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis and their machloket, and maybe that's the machloket between them, only about holacha shelo beregel, but a machshava and holacha beregel, even Rabbi Shimon would agree disqualifies, but we rejected that, right? We tried to reject it for one reason, from the Olat HaOf, but in the end we rejected it from the simple reading of Rabbi Shimon himself in his explanation. The Mishna only really fits with holacha beregel. Then we got to what if a zar does it and then a kohen, and what if a kohen does it and then a zar? Are those two machlokot connected or not? That was two different interpretations. Or in the second case, is it just that it has to in the end be brought at the end? The reason, right, the way we get the blood now has to be in a kosher manner, and therefore the order doesn't, right? That who is first, who is second? It's not the issue. The issue is how did it get there in the end, and the last action is what's important. And is that a machloket Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, which they claimed it was? In the end, we rejected Rabbi's reading of that Mishnah, of Rabbi Eliezer's position. In the end, the Mishnah has nothing to do with it. And there is no machloket. Everyone really thinks, also Rabbi Eliezer, also the rabbis, it needs to be brought there properly. So that if it was a redone holacha, right, it would have to be done properly also, and also that machshava during that time would be posel. That was the whole Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan debate, or not debate in the end. Then we got to the next Mishnah, the next chapter, which was all about a whole list of disqualifications, things that disqualify korbanot, and then we delved into how do we know that a zar disqualifies a korban, and with that we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and Shin Shema B'Salot Tovot.